Hello, my name is Jill Craneshaw, and I am on the faculty at the Wake Forest University School of Divinity in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Thank you for joining us for this program entitled Through a Glass Dimly, Dying and Death During COVID-19. How can religious leaders support people who are grieving losses during these days? In particular, how do we help people who are experiencing dying and death from a distance? Many of us are hearing the difficult stories. Funerals are being live streamed because of stay-at-home practices that limit the number of people who can be at cemeteries. Some people are dying alone because of quarantine regulations and safety precautions. We are all living life and experiencing dying and death from an unexpected, unfamiliar, and unwanted distance. You will hear from one of our alum, Gregory Griffey, later in this presentation. He and I talked recently about the distance between us caused by COVID-19. Greg shared an image that lingers with me. There are windows between us these days, he said, even at grocery stores. We are social distancing everywhere in our lives: funerals, gravesides, hospitals, nursing homes, even daily routines. A hope surfaced in that conversation. What if those windows, that distance, what if those windows are a kind of liminal space meant to protect us? And what if that space reveals sacredness as well? What possibilities might arise in this liminal space that we find ourselves in during COVID-19? In liturgies and theologies, liminal spaces are boundary or threshold spaces. They are in between moments where transformation can and often does happen. As difficult and even frightening as liminal spaces can be, their fluidity and instability make them spaces where creativity and even unexpected new life can emerge. The focal text for the presentation today comes from 1 Corinthians 13. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know, even as I am fully known. This text, of course, is really about a mirror. We don't really know everything there is to know about ourselves, about what it means to be a human being. We will know one day, but not now, and our not knowing has been revealed to us in all of its depth in recent days and weeks. I think that the glass here is also a window through which we can look and see and think about the gifts of this distance between us and imagine ways to provide good care for one another. We begin by thinking a little bit about the role and process of grief during this time.
I want to talk about collective grief, anticipatory grief, and disenfranchised grief. Right now, we're living in a time of collective grief, simply meaning that in some way or another, we are all grieving because the lives we once knew are gone, and they're gone forever. They will not be the same. One of the helpful ways of supporting people through collective grief is simply bringing it out of the shadows and into the light. So this could be on online platforms like Zoom or other ways. It could be creating a chain of phone calls within your community. One person calls another specific person, and that person calls another person, maybe weekly or every other week, so that people hopefully feel less isolated in the collective grief. In effect, then making the collective grief experience indeed a shared grief experience, because what we don't want is for people feeling isolated in their grief. A lot of people think that grief happens after a loss, but grief actually happens, or rather we begin to experience grief in anticipation of a loss or in anticipation of a possible loss. And this is what we call anticipatory grief. Some of the signs of anticipatory grief could be a lack of focus, feel like you're living in a cloud or a haze. Sometimes people say they have moments of disorientation or feeling overwhelmed. People might feel more sensitive to things they're not usually sensitive to. They might jump when the phone rings or when a car horn honks, or they might feel more sensitive to the statements of other people. One of the helpful ways of supporting people through anticipatory grief is simple naming, validating, and normalizing these experiences as something that we should be and will be expecting. So for example, right now, some people will say to me, I feel like I'm on a roller coaster ride, up and down, and I don't know what to expect from day to day. And when I normalize this as something to be expected at any time of grief, and especially at this time of collective grief, then people might sometimes say, oh good, I'm not going crazy after all. And so what this does in effect, or can do for people in effect, is to reduce the power that this grief experience has over people. And people can feel like that it's something that they can manage and they can live with after all. Disenfranchised grief is a kind of grief that people experience after a loss that doesn't get the social validation that it deserves. One example of that would be a miscarriage. Another example would be losing a loved one to Alzheimer's disease. For example, sometimes people will say, I've already lost mom. She's not who she used to be, and yet mom is still here. That's a kind of ambiguous loss that evokes a disenfranchised grief experience. Usually the community doesn't acknowledge this as a very significant loss until the person actually dies. Right now, I would imagine there's a lot of disenfranchised grief experience. People who lose loved ones after not being able to be with them if they died in the hospital or in a nursing home, not being able to have a funeral where a lot of people can come. They might be having some kind of disenfranchised grief experience. So one of the ways of supporting people with a disenfranchised grief is, again, bringing it out of the shadows and into the light by naming, validating, and normalizing it, so that then people feel understood and people feel like, yes, this is a significant loss. Not only have I lost Dad, but I'm not being able to get the kind of validation from my community that it deserves because we're having to practice social distancing. So if you're a caregiver in this time, I think by lifting that up and naming that out loud can be helpful for people. Don't be afraid to name these things. Remember that grief cannot be fixed, nor should we try to fix it, but we can facilitate the process of grief with people. Don't be afraid of evoking a tear or evoking sadness or evoking the anger associated with grief or naming the shock or denial with people when that feels appropriate. Because these experiences of grief are already there, and by bringing them out of the shadows and into the light and by talking about them and naming them with people, we're actually facilitating the grief process and helping people to grieve when they need to grieve.
The prophet Jeremiah in the Hebrew Bible speaks about grief and lament. Thus says the Lord of hosts, consider and summon the wailing women to come. Send for the skilled women to come. Let them quickly raise a dirge over us, so that our eyes may run down with tears and our eyelids overflow with water. COVID-19 summons us to lament. People in ancient communities, like the prophet Jeremiah's community, understood lament. Lament was a way people of faith cried out to God in the face of pain and loss. Lament was a communal act, and lament was a ritual act passed from one generation to the next. Why? Because the heartache that accompanies great loss is deeply personal, and at the same time, the cloud of witnesses that surrounds those in pain, the cloud of witnesses, those people who listen, hold vigil, weep with, that cloud prevents weeping from becoming an isolating experience. Lament arises from and returns to communities of faith and trust. And because of this communal dimension, lament and lament's wordless, sometimes soundless contortions of pain, anger, and grief. Lament, communities of lament, are sometimes the only thing that keep people going when everything good about life seems lost. The very fact of our humanity, its fragility and mortality, needs lament. And with this message from Jeremiah in mind, we look now at dying and death in the time of COVID-19.
Hello, I'm Dr. Latanya McIver-Penny, the pastor of New Mount Zion Baptist Church in Roxborough, North Carolina. We are living in a time that being a pastor is a real challenge. We're facing things each and every day that, quite honestly, Divinity School didn't write a lesson on. So I'm so glad to be able to share with you all during this time. Death and dying is very difficult for any family. It is more difficult for a family, in my opinion, as we are going through this pandemic. With the introduction of COVID-19 into our country, we begin to see some changes in the way that we were able to do church. We went from being able to have normal services to dropping down to 50 people and then ultimately no more than 10. My church has decided not to have any kind of services because we don't want to take the risk of exposing anyone who may be asymptomatic and not show any symptoms. So it's one thing to cancel service. It is one thing to decide not to have Bible study. It's another thing not to have youth group. Those are things that we can make adjustments for. Instead of having Bible study face-to-face, we have Bible study via a Facebook group that is done live each Wednesday. I teach it like I am right now, right from my dining room. That's easy to handle. It is easy to handle Sunday service. I set up a small podium in my house. I actually use my daughter's music stand as my podium, and then I go live from my dining room. The difficulty is, in death and dying, you can't just do that. It doesn't have an easy answer or a one answer fits all congregations or all types of leadership. For me, one of the toughest moments so far during the pandemic was when I lost one of my church members named George. George gave his life to Christ at a late age in life. He was in his 50s, and he decided that he wanted a different life. So his friends brought him to see me before he ever came to visit a service. And he met with me in my office, and I was able to introduce him to, I love to say this, I'm a good old country Baptist. I had the opportunity to introduce him to a man named Jesus. And so George gave his life to Christ and began coming to our church, and he got sick. And I had been able to visit George, and then you can't visit people anymore. So I was able to call George until he reached a point where he couldn't talk very well. So we had to get creative. So we had friends who would visit, or his sister would visit, and she would call and put me on speakerphone, and I could pray for him. We knew he was dying, but I couldn't be present. He was in an assisted living facility that didn't allow us in. So being present for him required some creativity. It required us being able to have family members who could connect us with that loved one. That's one case, but then George passed away. And at the time we could have 50 people in a service, and the family chose to do the service at a funeral home. They have a large family, and they decided that they only wanted family. So for me as his pastor, me as the person who watched him grow spiritually, it was very difficult to not be able to attend his funeral or to do his eulogy because the family had too many numbers. But being a pastor during this time has also taught me that I can't be selfish. I can't do church the way I want to do church. I can't do visits just the way I want to do visits, but I have to think creative to be present with those who are experiencing death in their family or in the process of dying. A couple of things that I would like to suggest is number one, you can always use, I know this sounds so insensitive, you can use Zoom to create a virtual time or FaceTime or any platform that can allow you to connect with that person one-on-one. I was able to check in on an accident victim last night from her home. All they needed was to pick up the phone, and I was able to FaceTime her to check in with her. That is a good way to stay immediately connected. But for those who may not have the technology, or for the almost 100-year-old member in my church who doesn't want to talk to her pastor on a cell phone, I do good old-fashioned phone calls. I am able to call and listen and be present with people, and just offering a time of presence. More than anything, I think that's what the church needs, and I think that's what individuals need as they are facing death and dying. I think they need to know that you're available and that you're present. For me, that may be me sending a handwritten note to them, as well as calling, as well as setting up times to pray. If they don't feel like talking, I text a prayer to them. It's about thinking about how to reach that individual and be present for that individual in their most dire times. Another way that I've been able to assist, and our church has been able to assist those who are experiencing death and dying, to support their family, is to provide a meal. We may not be able to cook like we used to and deliver that meal, but we can pay for a caterer to drop that meal off and be present with them by phone, to have communion with them. We can do so many things, but it requires us as pastors to think outside of the box, to think outside of the church, to think outside of those four walls. But most importantly, it requires us to be available. Available when they're crying. Available when they're afraid. Available when they just need to hear a comforting voice so that they could fall asleep at night. We have to figure out ways to offer assistance in any way that we can, and to be present when they need you the most. They don't need to know that you're busy, and they don't need to know that you have so much to do. I'm bivocational. I work and I pastor a church. I run a nonprofit. But when my church members call and they're experiencing death and dying, I try to make sure I'm available. And I want them to hear my voice if I'm the last voice they hear. And that may just be how it happens. It may be a phone call that you're able to offer prayer to a family who's standing by the bedside, offer prayer with a nurse who is holding up a phone for you to pray with that person as they're transitioning. It requires us to think differently and to do differently.
I want to talk about dying and death during COVID-19. From my experience as a hospice chaplain, some people are still able to die with the loved ones at the bedside. This is usually happening when people are able to die at home in hospice care and when loved ones feel comfortable being there. However, if people are dying in the hospital or in nursing homes or other care facilities, they may not be able to die with loved ones at the bedside. One of the things I am seeing, however, is an effort underway to bring more families in virtually through online platforms. Now, this may not always be possible, but it might be. So for example, if a hospital is swamped and overwhelmed with a surge of COVID patients right now, the care staff may be too overwhelmed to make this happen. The same could be said for nursing homes or other care facilities. But in some situations, it is happening. So if you're a minister caring for a family in this situation, you can check this out and advocate for it. If you have a person who's in a facility getting care, a nursing home, not the hospital, but a nursing home or another care facility, that person may very well also be getting hospice care, which means they have another layer of support. They have a hospice nurse and a hospice chaplain, a hospice social worker, and other caregivers giving support. Your hospice team can be an advocate along with you to help make some of this stuff happen for the family, because the hospice is a care philosophy focused on whole families and helping put the good in goodbye as much as possible for people. So, for example, one of the things that I've been able to do is to bring families in virtually through online platforms. Now, another thing that I've been able to advocate for successfully in some situations at nursing homes is for them to allow at least one family member at a time to come in at the bedside to say their goodbyes. Of course, all the while abiding by the proper infection control protocols, wearing a mask, having their temperature taken, whatever the facility has in place. But we have had some success in making that happen. So you as a minister can check this out and advocate for some of these things as well. In some situations, however, we've not been able to make this happen. There have been a couple situations where I've been with a family on the outside of a nursing home looking through a window at their dying loved one. Now, this is not an ideal situation, but it is better than not being able to be there at all for many families. One of the things that we can do in these situations is help foster some theological or spiritual reflection for families at this time. What does it mean to be looking through a glass darkly, for example, to use the scripture from the Christian tradition? Where is the divine and the liminal space of the glass between us? Now, when people are grieving in these situations, they're not going to be able to do deep theological reflection about this generally. But one of the things ministers can do is plant a little seed. In other words, to say something that might just come into the heart of someone, and it gives them a little nugget of something that they cling to. This is often the case at a time of grief for people. People will not remember a lot of things that you said, but they might remember one thing that brought them a little hope, that made them feel a little hopeful, or that brought a little bit of glimmer of beauty for them in a very hard time. And they hang on to this. And this helps foster resilience for them. Another thing you can do is make sure they're getting updates on their loved one. If they can't be by the window to see them, if they can't be brought in through virtual means, then make sure they're getting regular updates. Another thing that I'm seeing is some families are not getting regular updates from some facilities because the facilities are swamped if there's a surge of patients or a lot of COVID patients in the facility. So working with the care facility, working with the hospice team, especially if they have one, and advocating for routine updates, even if you're just a brief phone call to the family. This is huge for families right now. This can relieve a lot of anxiety just to know, for example, that dad had a better day today, right? Just to know what's going on so they're not left in the dark. Now, after death happens, we're also living in a time of social distancing, of course, and we can't be at a funeral. We can't have a lot of people at a funeral anyway. Maybe you can have up to 10 people or a small number of people at the graveside, for example. And some of the things that I'm hearing from some people right now is that they're craving this tactile experience. They can't get hugs. They can't put a hand on their shoulder for condolence. They can't shake hands. So some of the things you can do at a graveside is to have a little bit of dirt available for each person to throw in on top of the casket when it's lowered into the grave, or on top of the urn when it's put into the grave, if families are comfortable doing that. Or you could have an individual flower for each person to drop into the grave. This is a tactile, hands-on experience that some people are craving right now during a time of social distancing. And I also think it's important that as we create services and liturgies and rituals during such a time as this, that we're able to name this with the language appropriate for this, the theological or spiritual language that names the distance between us and where the divine might be in the distance between us, to bless the space between us in these situations, and to say the words of ashes to ashes and dust to dust and earth to earth, maybe as people are dropping the dirt in themselves. So just incorporating these tactile experiences can be really helpful for people in their grief and can help facilitate their process of grieving. I just want to leave you with a few resources that are online as well. I'm going to throw them out here. LifeWeb 360, Gathering Us, Reimagine. These are some websites that offer some online funerals and offers some online vigils for people that can be very helpful at a time like we're living in right now.
What do mourners need as they face loss in these days? Central to grieving and to rituals of lament are several familiar practices. When people are grieving, they share meals together. Family members tell stories, so do friends. We can't embody these familiar rituals right now in the ways that are most common and perhaps most comforting to us, but we may be able to imagine practices that draw us close in other ways. For example, photographs shared virtually can spark virtual storytelling through a variety of digital modes. Perhaps most important is that we imagine ways to fill the vacuum left in these moments. How might we create spaces for mourners to cry, laugh, remember, even wail? The aim is at least threefold. First, rituals like these, liturgies, give people a container for holding the range of emotions they are experiencing as a result of the loss. It gives them somewhere to put the feelings, to put the worries, to put the questions. Second, one aim of liturgies and rituals is to help people integrate the loss into their own life stories. And because we are isolated just now due to social distancing, it is much more difficult to process this dimension of grief. Because of social distancing, it is even more important that we are intentional in creating spaces of care where this connecting and integrating can happen. The third role of liturgies or of pastoral leaders in times of death is to help mourners connect their loss to their faith, whatever that means for those who are grieving. All of these aims and examples and more are ways we can bless the space between us during this time. Perhaps one strategy is actually to bless the space. To bless the space between us with a prayer, a liturgy, a word from Scripture. Something that will move in that gap and remind us that God is with us, that God's Spirit weaves us together. And with that as our hope, we can move forward during these days, knowing that one day we will be able to be together again, face to face.
I encourage you to be present in this time of COVID-19, to be present with those who need you, to be present with those in a way that you didn't think you were present. You may not be able to walk into the room, but your voice, your prayers, and your love can meet them where they are. So write notes, make phone calls, set up virtual prayer time, and be available. That's what they need when they're experiencing death and dying. I hope this helps. God bless you, and have a good day.
So we end where we began, with 1 Corinthians 13. For now we see through a mirror dimly, but then we shall see face to face. So much is happening in these days that is uncertain. We don't know what the future will be like. The images we see around us, and even the images we see looking back at us through our own mirrors, what we see is blurry, confusing, sometimes overwhelming. The challenges to our sense of identity as individuals and communities, the challenges are complicated. And the hope of faith, the story of God with God's people, is that these times, as complicated and confusing as they are, these times are also full of possibilities. The promises of faith are, have been, and always will be. The promise of faith is that God is with us on this and every life journey. As we continue on down this for now road, I am grateful for chaplains and pastors like Gregory Griffey and Latanya McIver Penny. I am grateful for all clergy and ministers who provide care for those who feel alone and uncertain. What you do to share God's presence and grace, what you do and who you are, matters. May we all be blessed as we continue to embody and share God's love in the days ahead.